when we share a gospel story. We are looking through a lens. We are getting a glimpse of who Jesus is as seen through the eyes of his friends. And we also know that we are getting a backwards glance. For these stories are not eyewitness accounts, but are collective memories held as sacred witness to what mattered most about Jesus. These stories were shared and passed down and treasured, written by his followers several decades after his death. And in this way, the Gospels tell us of the sacred story of Jesus' life, yet always in the shadows of his death and the light of his resurrection. For the writers knew the end of the story. And of course, the end of the story is what this season of Lent and soon to be Easter are all about. Or should I say the rest of the story? For the life that appeared to end on that hill called Calvary was not the ending at all. And of course, our gospel writer of this morning, John, knows that as he is telling this story. This particular gospel harkens us back to a passage we shared not too long ago, the story of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. For here Jesus is again, in the home of Mary and Martha and his dear friend, enjoying a dinner party in Lazarus' honor. Now, after all, if the prodigal son's father was prepared to throw him a feast when he was only metaphorically dead and brought back to life, imagine how Lazarus' family felt when he went through the real deal. A party was in order. And as you may remember, Lazarus had been dead for 4 days in the tomb when Jesus raised him from the dead. This resurrection stunned and inspired the crowds, and they began to follow Jesus. And you may also remember that this caused a lot of trouble for Jesus with the religious authorities. The high priests and the Pharisees, whose job it was to maintain the temple and uphold the law and keep the Roman powers at bay as best they were able, felt that Jesus had gotten out of control. It was one thing for him to be causing trouble in the outlands, curing lepers and performing miracles and exorcising demons. But raising a man from the dead, and just on the outskirts of Jerusalem, where everyone was watching, was too much. He had gone too far. The people were beginning to think that Jesus was the Messiah, the one who would free them from the tyranny of Rome. And this had to stop, or they would all be. The religious leaders were starting to panic. So all this intrigue and tension is swirling around the outside of the house, but inside, Jesus is surrounded by his dearest friends, celebrating. Martha, the dutiful sister, was in the kitchen as usual, setting the table and preparing the meal. Lazarus is sitting in the living room with Jesus and the other fellows talking, as men do. All very ordinary. But Mary, who got scolded for sitting at Jesus' feet, who is never where she's supposed to be, who always seems to see Jesus in a way that the others do not, Mary is about to shake things up. She enters the room with a costly jar of perfume ointment, nard, something that could cost a half a year's wages. And she does two things that shock the dinner party. She uncovers and unbinds her hair, something that women only did for their husbands. And she kneels down, and she begins to anoint Jesus' feet with oil. This was not merely the hospitable act of a good hostess washing the feet of the guest. It goes well beyond that. I don't know about you, but I find this description, frankly, erotic. It is an act so tender, so intimate, so sensual, and yet so public. And it is a risky act, an extravagant act. And it offers us a startling glimpse of who Jesus is through her eyes. Which is really quite striking, for as we know, the Bible was written by men and for centuries has only been interpreted by men, which makes it all the more remarkable that it is often the women in these stories who teach us who Jesus truly is. From Elizabeth's first greeting of Mary as the mother of my Lord, to the Samaritan woman at the well, to the bleeding woman who touches the hem of Jesus' garment, to Mary Magdalene's encounter with the risen Christ in the garden, it appears that women, perhaps by virtue of the fact that they are so often overlooked, perhaps because they live their lives on the fragile margins, or perhaps because their own hearts are so often broken, it is the women who seem to see Jesus most clearly. And here in her bold and loving and passionate act, does this Mary too open our eyes to see the big picture, the true significance of Jesus. He is not just a beloved friend, not just an honored guest. He is God beside her. He is the manifestation of divine love. And he will not be with them for long. She recognizes this heartbreaking truth, and she anticipates the pain that lies ahead for him. And overwhelmed by love, without care for propriety or appearance, without inhibition or concern for what the men will say, she acts on that love. She has her eyes on God. Yet her actions do scandalize the men in the room, most especially Judas, who berates her for her extravagance and her wastefulness. Now Judas kept the purse for this group, and he knows the value of that oil she is using, and his reaction is swift and stinging. Perhaps he's just embarrassed by this intimate display. Perhaps he's jealous of Mary's relationship to Jesus. Or perhaps, taking him at his word, he really does care about spending money on luxuries when there are so many hungry mouths to feed. But John makes it clear that Judas's concern for the poor is an act. Here, on the edge of his ultimate betrayal, Judas pretends to know what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And as we all know, it's just so easy to talk the talk. Is he a hypocrite? Or is he just blind? In the scriptures, Judas often plays the role of the villain, the plotter, the deceiver, the betrayer. But I truly think that Judas is mainly unable to see Jesus for who he is. He is afraid, perhaps, of what it might mean for him if he does. His fear causes his heart to harden, to shrink, to be corrupted by the delusion of scarcity. Judas was one who often held back, who would not allow himself to embrace that radical trust and outrageous generosity of Jesus' message. Ultimately, he allows his heart to be bought for the sum of 30 silver pieces, as he buys into the culture of fear that shrouds all those who call for Jesus' death. He is rooted in the idea that there is not enough love or money or Jesus to go around. But Mary saw things differently. And it is with her open and vulnerable heart that she shows us what it truly means to be a disciple of Jesus. She is not rejecting the needs of the poor. She is embracing the reality of the one in front of her. And it brings her to her knees in a posture of passion and compassion. She must wonder why everyone else is just sitting around. She must wonder why no one else can see Jesus as she does. As hard as her life has been, she has not let pain or fear or cynicism harden her heart or blind her vision. She has not allowed the culture of fear to swallow her up. Instead, she is our teacher and our guide, and our example of what a life rooted in extravagant love and vulnerable courage can look like. And she points us through Jesus to God. For these past several weeks, we've been experiencing these stories, this season of Lent, this journey to the heart of God through the lens of the Beatitudes. And they've been helping us to focus on the heart of Jesus' message, on the essence of his ministry. This morning, through Rachel's gorgeous poem, on Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God, she finds within her own life the vulnerability of two hearts, a tiny baby's heart and her own as a woman and a mother who at times was assailed by anger and grief and insecurity and hope while she lavished her love on her newborn child. Leaning over her daughter in her hospital crib, she recalls that, delighted by my hair on her body then, oblivious to her own fragile mortality, she smiled her pure pink, dummy smile at me. In Rachel's memory, we see a reflection of Mary's unbound hair caressing the feet of Jesus, the once fragile baby whose holy heart is seen only by those whose own hearts have been broken. In Rachel's poem, her tears are for the beginning of life, for her own Jesus Christ in a baby costume. In Mary's story, her tears are for the end. Yet in their mixture of pain and hope and love, in their purity of heart, they both experience the transformative power of love, the healing and hope that comes from giving yourself freely to the manifestation of God in our midst. And both see the reality of God more clearly. This story, this day, brings us up to the edge of Holy Week, the last leg of our Lenten journey, which will begin next Sunday. But here, now, surrounded by his friends, his death foreshadowed in Mary's tears, Jesus is on the edge of Jerusalem. He is waiting now to enter that holy city as the King of Peace, even as Pontius Pilate and all the world, through power and violence, prepare to meet him. Next Sunday, we will enter the gates with him, with hearts open, full of hope, promise, joy. And we will travel with him to the dark places where betrayal and fear lay in wait. We will confront our own hypocrisy and our own blindness, and it will be hard. But for now, today, in this moment, we look to Mary, her heart pure and her eyes wide open. She shows us what matters now. She shows us that God is in our midst and in need of our love. May our vision be clear and our hearts courageous, so that we may follow Jesus where he must go. Amen.